Shabbat Shalom again. We'll now go into the study of the Archetype of Jacob. And by the way, what we mean is archetype. By archetype, again, is that the Bible, as in many places, great literature and great archetypal psychology, meaning that, like any great literature, the characters that we study are not characters who live then, but rather characters who live in us, meaning one of the ways that we understand ourselves is by studying what's happening in the Torah as a reflection of what's happening within us. Last time I gave you what I consider to be the best image I have of a Jewish Hasidic archetypal psychology is a term used by the Baal Shem Tov, taken from the book of Noah, where God commands Noah to put a tzohar in the ark. Now the rabbis argue whether tzohar was a lamp to shine light in the interior of the ark. Other rabbis say it was a small window, as an aperture in the ark. So whatever tzohar means, it brought light down into the teva. Of course, many of you know that the Hebrew word teva means a container, like a tevat doar, a post box in Israel. It's also the teva of Moshe, meaning a little barge in which Moses' mother put him. But it's also the Hebrew word for a word. Now, not the semantic meaning of the word, which is milah, but rather the orthographic presentation of the word and the sound of the word. So, for example, the way you say abbreviation in Hebrew is rashi tevot, the beginning of the initials of the beginning initials of a word. So, for example, Rashi is rashi tevot of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. So Hebrew makes much more use, by the way, of these kinds of abbreviations than does the English language. You can't read one paragraph of an Israeli newspaper without having some understanding of Israeli Rashi Tevot, Israeli abbreviations. So in any case, the Baal Shem Tov said, with this great Hasidic play on words, to put a tzohar in the teva, which means a window into each word. I explained this last night, that this is one of the great paths of the Jewish Hasidic path of depth, which we put windows into words, and as it says in the Baal Shem Tov's great work called Amud HaTfilah, the Pillar of Prayer, that when we put a window into the word and we peer down into the window of the word, according to the Baal Shem Tov, we see souls, we see worlds, we see angels, we see the divine. So we see this infinite depth of this great flurry of meaning going on down in there. So my image is that our soul looks into the tzohar, into the window or gem above each word, sinks into it, and our soul in communication with the soul of the word creates a dialogue going back between we, the reader, us, the reader, the depth of the word. The depth of the word reaches into the reader, and in that, the transformation in the realm of the soul takes place. Now, last night, I exemplified that by reading what I think is the greatest work of 20th century Jewish liturgy, which is Leonard Cohen's Book of Mercy. I think it is one of the greatest pieces of liturgy ever in the Jewish tradition, certainly in the 20th century, and maybe in the entire modern period. So one thing I'd like to do on Friday nights is study that book that I read parts of it during the Yamim Noraim and during the Days of Awe. But we didn't slow down and read their poems, I call them psalms, each psalm one at a time, and as it were, taking our souls, putting a window onto the poem, and then reading into the depth of the poem, allowing the depths of the poem to read into us. So I'd like to take this, we use this interpretive device constantly. What I like to do is to name it from now on as often as possible, what it means to put a window into the text, to see into the depths of the text, and allow the depths of the text to speak into us. The first thing we do when we study, for example, the Archetype of Jacob, is just for a moment reimagine his state of mind. So part of archetypal psychology is not just to read the character. For example, this Torah begins, Vayetze Yaakov me Beersheva, Vayelech Harana. Jacob departed from Beersheba and went to Haran. Who was Jacob at that moment? So in my Shabbat thought, I'm using the text plus the Midrash to imagine the inner state of Jacob, and therefore ruminating within myself, have I ever been in that inner state? or have other people been in that inner state? And have people whom I've counseled ever been in this inner state? Which means, does Jacob reflect an inner, deep psychological moment of the human condition? So here's my words. Jacob is bemoaning his fate as he trudges toward Padan Aram. Jacob was the dweller in tents. By the way, the Midrash tells us, and I think this is a fascinating tradition that we've gone into here and there, that the tents he studied in was the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever. And this is a brilliant rabbinic creation. Shem is the son of Noah. Ever is his grandson. According to the rabbis, they created a pre-Torah wisdom academy, something that just existed in the ancient world. And every time there's a great gap in the lives of one of our ancestors, the assumption is they've gone to study in the Beit Midrash or the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. It's fascinating for me to try to imagine what their curriculum was. In fact, that's a very playful idea of mine. What did they study before Torah? The natural law, the human condition. It's a fascinating, playful concept for me. But for the rabbis to assume that the wisdom of the ancestors came from the Beit Midrash of the son of Noah and his grandson Ever. By the way, the Midrash also says when Rebecca went to get her oracle on what was happening inside of her, and she was told the two nations were contesting within her, and that the elder will serve the younger, they say that was received in the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever. It's a fascinating idea in and of itself. So you might say this was Jacob's identity. Among other things, he was a spiritual seeker. You might say he went to study the truth of God, to understand the depth of experience. Another archetype of Jacob is the eternal graduate student who never goes and grapples with life. That is actually a very powerful archetype. This is a different archetype. This archetype is the person who goes and studies and, as it were, separates oneself in the world to go into the yeshiva, the full-time yeshiva student, the full-time student in the monastery or in the ashram, which means they're not avoiding the world, they're going into the hidden world. In fact, one of the meanings of the word mystic is that there is another reality, the metaphysical reality, that is as real or more real than ours. By the way, I was talking about this in my All in Everything class this week, and this is one of the great contributions of Hegel to modern thought. Hegel took the world of value, the world of metaphysical reality very seriously. Now, Kant said we can't fully know it, but Kant said we certainly can talk about it, and there are better and worse words to talk about metaphysical reality. Hegel took that challenge and discussed, in a very powerful way, what it would mean to study metaphysical reality. And between Kant and Hegel, you might say the great contours of modern thought have been laid before us. It's a wonderful thing to study, and perhaps I'll in my All in Everything class, if we continue it, I'll go into the study of Kant and Hegel. In any case, we're going to assume that this is our building the archetype of Jacob. He was able to get the birthright where it belonged, which means away from Esau and upon himself. And then the idea would be that now that he is the acknowledged leader of the tribe, again, this is my ruminations, that he would now assume leadership, delegate most responsibility, and go back to his mystical studies. But of course, two things happen. One is that Esau very clearly swears that the day his father Isaac dies, he will kill Jacob. And I think when, according to our text, when Esau uttered those words were taken extremely seriously. The second thing is his mother Rebecca looks around and says, I don't want Jacob marrying one of the girls from this neighborhood. We're not exactly sure what was wrong. It does mention the Hittites. Were the Hittites a rowdy crowd? We don't know. But we do know, by the way, that Uriah the Hittite lived across the street from King David, married to Bathsheba, and when David desired Bathsheba and impregnated her, he had Uriah killed on the field of battle. This very, very terrible story is recounted in the book of 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, if I'm not mistaken. So Hittites were constant neighbors of us. Obviously, they served in high places in the army of King David. We don't know exactly what they were contemporaneously, but we do know that Rebekah didn't like them. She said, I want you to go back to the homeland. I want you to go back up to my brother Lavan and find someone up there. So what do we find? As bad as the Hittites might have been, none of them probably could have been as bad as Rebekah's brother Laban. He is the archetypal con man swindler in the book of Genesis. In fact, when in the book of Deuteronomy, when it says Arami Oved Avi, which probably means my father was a wandering Aramaean, there's a strong school of thought that says the Arami refers to Laban, and Oved doesn't mean lost, but tried to kill. So you'll see in some passages from Haggadah, it says an Aramaean tried to kill my father. That's Laban trying to kill Jacob. Or it says a wandering Aramaean was my father, referring to Abraham. There are two different translations of that. So in this archetype, as I contemplated it, I see Jacob on the road, and it reminded me of the story of Cain, who becomes a Na-Vinad. In modern Hebrew, a Na-Vinad is a bohemian, is a traveler, someone who never settles down. In fact, it's a Hebrew word that relies on the Yiddish. A constant traveler who never settles down is called a Nadvinadnik, if you want to increase your Hebrew Yiddish vocabulary. A Nadvinadnik is someone who thinks that the truth is out there somewhere on the road and doesn't ever commit him or herself to one place, to one community. Anyway, but in the story of Cain, he's a Nadvinad because God has banished him. So if Jacob knew the stories of the ancestors, he might have learned this in the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever. In my imagine, he's ruminating that in some deep psychological way, he's killed his brother Esau. So whatever his brother Esau thought his life would be, Jacob has destroyed it. Jacob and his mother and God, but Jacob is the one who did the deed. On the other hand, like Cain and Abel, Esau has sworn to kill Jacob. And now if we look at that originating sibling myth early in Genesis, and we look here, one thing that we see is from this point on, I'll call it the sibling myth, dominates the book of Genesis. What do I mean by the sibling myth? The idea, number one, of the competition between human beings, sometimes siblings, but sometimes people who know us, where we lock our horns with another person and an incredible envy develops, some kind of great desire for punitiveness, that person, sibling or not, something happens enough where we say, I have to destroy that person. I have to ruin that person. Whatever they have, I have to have. Sometimes it's a sibling, sometimes it's something else. Other people trigger within us an archetypal hostility. Now, you don't see in this story. You do see that there is some hostility between Jacob and Esau, but at a certain moment, Jacob has to do, the steely deed of lying to his father, tricking his father, and getting the birthright. Rebekah didn't call a family meeting to talk about all this. There was a family secret that, according to Rebekah, could only be handled in some kind of conspiratorial way. Now, the archetypal hatred, the archetypal antagonism does come out with Esau. Jacob has to hit the road. So he's like Cain psychologically, in that he, psychologically speaking, annihilated his brother, but his brother actually wants to annihilate him. So that's just one thing for us to think about. And think about very deeply. Have you ever had in your life where you found yourself the object of someone else's toxicity? Either an aggressive or passive-aggressive words. You get the sense that someone just wants to take you out. Someone wants to bring you down. Someone wants to cut you down, put you down. I call it the 4 C's: criticizing, complaining, condemning. And you suddenly feel yourself the object of another person's ire, as if their identity is annihilating you. Now, you may have felt this yourself. You find yourself saying things to people, thinking things about people, and that you realize that you have a spirit in you. In you, you have a spirit of aggression and resentment, and you catch yourself saying things to people, either aggressively or passive aggressively, or thinking it, and you look at yourself and you say, I had no idea that much darkness lived within me. Now, this takes great self-knowledge and great courage, as every transformative practice teaches, is to disidentify from the narrative, especially the narrative that flows out of the shadow. Because when this hateful, resentful, destructive narrative flows out of the shadow, we identify with it. We assume it's all true. And then you engage in spiritual practices of observation, and you look down at it and say, that is so horrible what's happening inside of me. Look at this flow of toxicity flowing down inside of me, projected onto somebody, and then you begin to ask yourself, is it they or is it I? So just this archetype of Cain and Abel and the sibling rivalry that you see along, from an archetypal perspective, it could be spouses. From an archetypal perspective, it could be parents and children. From an archetypal perspective, it could be colleagues. It could be friends, where this archetypal energy of animosity suddenly locks in and you become a different person. You're not the person that you know. Suddenly you see the shadow unleashed. And one thing to remember, whenever we're doing shadow work, by the way, which is our topic of our last few sessions on Wednesday nights, the mistake is to say to another person, now I know who you really are. Now I know what you really think. Or, oh my God, this is who I really am. What you really are is a person with many levels of consciousness. That's one of them. And ideally, part of who we are is the conscious human being who's looking at that toxicity, who's looking at that negativity, who's looking at the hatred and the animosity down in the shadow, and instead of pushing it out of consciousness and let it hijack our narrative about ourselves and others, we take responsibility for it. We start to work it through. That whatever our judgments are, that they're rational, that they're proportional, that they're rooted in justice, and they're not rooting in our feelings. So this is an archetype I've never spoken really before. I don't think about the sibling rival archetype in the book of Genesis, but in Cain and Abel, in here, we see in further Torah portions between Joseph and his brothers and so forth. This is a deep theme that if one is to study the book of Genesis carefully, meaning if we're going to put a window on the text and look into the text and look deeply into the text, one thing you see is hatred and resentment and envy, and the urge to annihilate is down inside this text. Your soul sees it, and the text sees you. And the text is going to ask you, is this you? Do you have any of this? Or does somebody else you know have it toward you? And whichever side you're on, and sometimes we've been on one side in one part of our life and another side in another part of our life, what are we going to do about this? Because we know it's not, as Hosea says, we know it is not the path of righteousness. So that's one archetypal psychological note I'd like to make here. He goes off, he has the blessing of his father, he has the blessing of God, as I say in my Shabbat thought. He goes, lives with the swindler Laban. He wants to marry Rachel, married Leah instead. Then he marries Rachel. And we know more tragedy awaits Jacob. So again, I wonder in this archetype where he says to himself, I feel I've been touched by God and called by God, and everything's gotten worse. And I have to share with you, as although I'm on break from the Academy for Jewish Religion, I've been teaching since I think 2021, up until I went on break in 2017. I've counseled many rabbinical students. I've been a mentor of many rabbinical students, and I have stayed in touch with many students. And either while in rabbinical school or after rabbinical school, a student gets in touch with me and says something like the following. This has happened, I think, at least 10, 15 times in my life as a rabbi professor, where a student will say, I felt so excited to become a rabbi. I felt so excited to become to rabbinical school. But it's not what I thought. We're not learning to be people of God. We're not learning to be masters of the holy text. Something else is being taught, but it's not what I wanted to know. And the person says, I know I have to take these classes. I know I have to be an educated person. And they say, except for you, Rabbi Finley, and they name typically 3 or 4 others, I'm not learning about my soul. And I say to them, you can always take my classes. We can continue studying. You're a worthy person. You'll be a fantastic rabbi. You got to get through this. And then I get an email from a person a few years out. And unfortunately, they've landed in a bad place. They've landed in a place where there's internal conflict in the congregation. There's animosity toward the clergy. It's a well-known phenomenon. There's a literature on called The Dragons in the Church, where the clergy person animates certain kinds of issues with members of the church or synagogue, and they work out those issues on the oftentimes defenseless clergy person who has no idea what's going on. They came to the church or synagogue with the best of intents and suddenly finds themselves the object of other people's toxicity. I'm thankful for this literature because, when I used to teach spiritual leadership at the AJR, I brought this literature. By the way, none of it is written by Jews. It's as if there's a shadow about congregational life that the rabbinical organizations don't want to talk about. In the church, this is a very much talked about as part of the training at Fuller Theological Seminary. So I brought this literature over to the AJR, and I reminded my students about 1 in 5 places you're going to arrive at is going to be in a bad place, and you're going to wonder what's happening to you. It might be you. You might just be clumsy, awkward, or not a fully polished professional yet. But the animosity that will come at you is disproportionate from whatever mistakes you make at a person. Be ready for it, because what they're projecting onto you can be profoundly painful. So then I get the email from a person who's been out a few years and says, Rabbi Finley, yeah, I took the course. I heard everything you said. Some part of me didn't believe you. I wrote the paper. I did the readings. I passed the test. I thanked you. And 3 years out, I wish I'd listened carefully, because everything you said will happen to 1 in 5 of us, happened to me. I didn't memorize the skills, and now not only am I in over my head, but the person says, I hate being a clergy person. I hate being a rabbi. I hate being a cantor. I spent 5 years in rabbinical school. This is the dream of my life. And now I don't know what I'm doing. I want out. I don't know how to make myself feel better about this. I did not expect this to happen. Now, that's the archetype, and I think any person who works with other people, it could be a therapist, it could be a physician, it can be life coach, it can be someone in the public world, social workers, teachers, where people go into the profession truly wanting to help and be of service to others, and suddenly, I don't know if it's 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, suddenly you go into a context where it seems as everything has turned on you, and you say to yourself, I had such good intentions. I gave so much of my life to learning how to be a teacher, a therapist, a clergy person, and so forth, a social worker. And it's all gone horribly. And when I reflect on these conversations and emails that I've had, people said, am I naive? Those who took the class, you told us about this. It just never occurred to me it could happen to me. So when I look at the archetype of Jacob, I see him as the archetype of what is called the wounded healer. It's an archetype in most depth psychology. The wounded healer is the teacher, the physician, the clergy person, the therapist, who's gone in and is profoundly wounded by the profession. I'm not saying they don't bear some responsibility, but the response is, I think, objectively disproportional. Now, so where do we see this idea of this archetype, the wounded healer? It has its fulfillment in next week's Torah portion, that for Jacob to truly own inheriting the covenant, he has to undergo this wound. He has to undergo the physical wound, which stands for acknowledgement of the internal wound. And now the question is, and by the way, this isn't just wounded healers. This just isn't other people. It's all of us who've done anything in life, deciding to have a spouse romantic partner, deciding to bring children into the world, deciding to do one thing or another with the best of intentions, the greatest hope, and suddenly it's a profoundly wounding, excruciatingly horrible experience, and you say to yourself, what do you do? Now, working along this archetype, now the rest of my Shabbat thought. So here's my comment on that, and then I'll go back to the middle. Maybe somebody's life goes as planned. This is my reading, my Shabbat thought. But I have not met that somebody yet. Life cares very little about our plans. When life doesn't go according to our plans, people say, now what? Now what? That is a question of depth. It's not the question of, can I get behind my wall of virtue? Can I think more rationally about my life? Can I examine and regulate my inner life? There's something deeper that says, it's all gone so terribly wrong. What do I do now? What many people do when life doesn't go according to plan, either great or small, just with one person, one place, one thing, is not what you wanted. At least initially, is to complain, to grieve poorly, to deny, to fight the truth of the situation, to anger at someone or anger at God, eventually depress. Many people become bitter and they just check out. If life is a battle, as it says in Psalms 144:1, then it seems that we have to surrender. And here I'm paraphrasing Leonard Cohen. If life is a dealer, we've already lost the game. Another adage comes to mind. When some doors close, others open. More accurately, I think, when some doors close, we become aware of others. Maybe maybe obscured by our being fixated on the door now locked. I just want to bring that to the inner life of some people. Some people are locked in such animosity with another person that they've closed the door on that person, and that the person has closed the door on them, but another door is open, which is the door of conflict. And they explain what they did, what happened between them and the conflict. And I say, well, there's another door. And they say, what? I says, the door of reconciliation. And people say, there is no door of reconciliation. This can never, ever be healed. And that's when we, of course, have the teachings of Hanukkah, which I'll be teaching this afternoon at our gathering. The teachings of Hanukkah is against the Yetzer Hara that says, this temple can never be purified. This menorah can never, ever have holy light. It's a fixated position of the Yetzer Hara. So in my imagination of Jacob, and I think because every time I work on this Parsha, Hanukkah is around the corner, I think about the doors closed, the door of conflict and animosity, depression and grief, not grieving well, is open, and we're stuck. And then we take a breath, we calm down and say, well, maybe there is another door open. But the door that's open is the door to incredibly hard work. And maybe that's one reason we don't want to see that door. Because it's not a door to an easy inner journey. It's a door to a tough journey. As a counselor, I'm back to my Shabbat thought, I often find myself guiding people through the now what. One thing seems to be required. We must go deeper than the pain, deeper than the loss, deeper than the grief. The way through loss is depth. We live in a society that does not teach much about that depth, nor about the life of virtue that helps us retain our dignity when we suffer. Much of what we see is, quoting a book that I read, the culture of complaint. When things don't go our way, we have to blame someone, typically ensuring that life doesn't go their way either. We either need to punish, we take our loss out on them. The need to blame, punish, complain, for me is an indication of immaturity, a state of character that has little to do with chronological age. The complaining character has decided that they do not have the capacity for resilience, the capacity to hold the line and work things through with virtue and with honor, blaming instead of growing, resenting instead of making a plan, maybe even a plan that is one day at a time, as an answer to the now what. The despairing person might exhibit addictive behavior, medicating the pain instead of going deeper than the pain. Despair seems to say anything but dignity and depth. Life is what happens while we're making other plans. By the way, who wrote that line? Reader's Digest in 1958 quoted Alan Saunders. So if you're looking for who wrote Life is what happens when we're making other plans, Alan Saunders, 1958. Alan Saunders wrote many comic book strips, including Steve Roper, Mary Worth, and others. No one could track down which comic book strip, but Reader's Digest in 1957 or 58 quoted Alan Saunders. John Lennon used the line to great effect, but it was not his line. Eventually, it seems, you have to make a new plan, or that unruly force that we euphemistically call life will make a plan for us. Either you lead your life, or the events of life lead you. That's a choice we have to make. Am I simply responding to things in a habitual way where my unconscious ego self and oftentimes the Yetzer Hara makes the plan for us? Or do we decide to consciously say, well, that was that, then is now, and now what am I going to do? But whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to lead with consciousness and honor and with dignity. Understanding that life might intrude again, this euphemism called life. One must come out of the habits of blaming, complaining, unproductive grief, despair, and loss into a life of depth and wisdom, perhaps even achieving deep well-being, and perhaps moments of bliss. This is hard work, bitterly hard. You can plan a life, but more deeply, we have to plan who we will become no matter what life delivers to us. And my postscript is, I wish I knew another way, but I don't. Just a couple of words about last night. Roland made a comment when I talked about archetypal psychology. He referenced the book by James Hillman and Michael Ventura, published back in the 80s. That's the title of which is a complaint. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and no one's getting any better. Now, I don't think they base this on a great deal of research, but they base this on many people who go into psychotherapy and they don't seem to change. In fact, they get more and more stuck. Now, I think it's unfair because many people have found themselves deeply in sync with a talented, wise, gifted, compassionate person, and it's a thriving experience. But other people, either because the people didn't get in sync, or because the methodology wasn't great, or the person was too stuck. Who knows why when you bring yourself to the wisdom of another person, it doesn't produce the fruit that you want, but James Hill and Michael Ventura singled out, as far as I recall the book, and I have it back here, I'm going to go reread it. One problem is that so much, I'm going to call the trade, not the gifted practitioners, but the tradesperson of some therapeutic enterprises only focuses on the past. Your mother, your father, what happened when, how that created with you, your own object relations patterns, and now you bring that and you cathect that onto other places in your life. That's true, but it's only part of the truth. As I've said before, when a person says, this is who I am because of what happened to me, as a counselor, I'll say, unfortunately, that is one of the greatest lies of the Yetzer Hara. When a person says, I am this way because of what happened to me, that is the Yetzer Hara lying to you. Because from my perspective, we are as we are, heard me say this many times, for three reasons. Our genetics and personality, for sure. We're not born a blank slate. Our childhood before we have language is of greater importance than the number of chronological years that we spend as infants and small children. And then everything since. Now, why do I say everything since? I truly think Daniel Siegel is a great man. His books on the developing mind, his book Mindsight has strongly influenced my work. In fact, a couple of versions of the book that I'm finally edited into its final form. One reason former editors have rejected it was too long because I was trying to integrate wisdom work with neuropsychology. It was too long, and I decided to say to people, if you want to understand the neuropsychological background of what I'm teaching, go study Daniel Siegel. So Daniel Siegel has a book called The Developing Mind, where he shows that the mind never stops developing. You're not who you are because of what happened back then. You're also who you are because of what happened yesterday. And not only what happened yesterday and a year before and 10 years before, but of the decisions you made, consciously and unconsciously, as you dealt with your developing mind, encountering the interneuropsychology of other people. And that's why these interpersonal relationships are so profound, and why I focus so much on virtue and rationality and depth. Because when you're in a bad place and you're criticizing somebody and complaining about somebody, yeah, you get to talk. But we can't account for the amount of damage we do to other people's psyche. It is so irresponsible to not get behind your wall of virtue. It is morally irresponsible. For you, you're saying what you feel. The other person's observing it. So for me, the wall of virtue, which is you get more and you say, today, whatever I'm going to do, I'm not going to criticize other people, including in passive-aggressive ways, which includes, by the way, passive-aggressive language and unsolicited advice. Because when you give unsolicited advice, that's a way of saying, you don't know enough, I'm going to school you, you're not okay, I'm okay, you're insufficient, I'm sufficient. We don't know that when we keep hectoring our children and spouses with unsolicited advice, but that's one thing we're communicating. So without going through the whole thing, I do this in my wisdom classes, no criticizing, no complaining, no condemning, which is the overtop language that people unfortunately sometimes use, and no escalating conflict. Why? A, it's not mature. Secondly, it's not authentic to the authentic self. But most importantly for me, it borders on immorality because you're causing unnecessary harm in another person. So what Daniel Siegel has shown in his book, The Developing Mind, and the continuity of intrapersonal neuropsychology, we shape the psychic states of other people by how we behave, by how we speak to them and how we speak behind their backs. We are creating their psychic world. We are creating their psychic worlds. And, most of us are durable and most of us are resilient. But so much of that is just unnecessary. Look, life includes necessary suffering, necessary losses. That is true. The sad thing is the unnecessary suffering that we bring to others. And this in the archetypal psychology of the Jacob character and the Aesop character. When life goes wrong, what do you do next? Well, for some people, it's, again, the more aggressive accusative. For some people, it's the more self-attacking, self-loathing, guilt, shame, envy, so on and so forth. Those are responses to life, and those are inner decisions that we made. It's very hard for people to think that aside from true, let's say, chemical imbalances and brain chemistry and so forth, our emotions, our feelings, our thought patterns, our habits. They're not hardwired. I think our personalities are hardwired. What we do with our personality, from my perspective, is called character, and character is choice. Why are we as we are? Genetics and personality, early childhood, everything since, including our history of decisions, conscious and unconscious. Those are three things. So a person says, I am because of my past, don't only include what happened to you. Include what you've chosen to do about it consciously and unconsciously. Reviewing our history of conscious and unconscious choices is one of the greatest paths towards self-knowledge. You go back to a moment in life, and this is, by the way, part of the depth practice. You go back to moments in life, and you don't only say what happened, you say to yourself, what in me chose that response? What accumulation of unconscious ego self forces? Was it a conscious drive to goodness? Was it a drive to goodness as a mask for the Yetzer Hara? Was it the Yetzer Hara itself, the destructive patterns itself? Going back and discovering the history, the inner history of motivations, and therefore the inner history of choices, is probably the most important thing you can do when saying, I am who I am because of my past. Yes, it's what happened to you. But for me, more than anything, it's about how you consciously and unconsciously chose to respond to what happened to you. Now, from my way of thinking. And I remember, I think it was Hillman and Ventura who inspired this thought of me back in the 1980s. What Hillman and Ventura thought was, instead of a psychology of the past, create a psychology of destiny. Now, again, I don't believe that there's a fixed destiny for us, but try to imagine you are destined to be a whole human being beyond the horizon, that is your destiny. Well, the past won't get you there. You can make choices to get you there. So the most important question is, in addition to my genetics and personality, my early childhood, everything that's happened to me, and every decision I've made is, what kind of person do I want to be tomorrow? That's the fourth level of why we are as we are. For me, the only one we have control of today is number 4. Deciding what kind of person you want to be is the only part of your life of which you have control right now. That's it. That's all you have. Now, to understand the choice in front of you, you do have to understand who you are, how you got here, a detailed history of your choices, conscious and unconscious, that brings you to this very moment. This is very deep. This is very transformative. So the person who says to me, oh, I am like I am because I came from this traumatic family and this horrible thing happened to me. And you would not believe how incredibly toxic my spouse is and how much they trigger me. And you would not believe how much my child is an unhappy person that influences my life. And I say, I think I know what you mean by you won't believe it, but let's stop metaphorically. Of course I believe it because I've heard it. Okay, and I've heard it many times. So let's just take a breath here. You have a rough past. You have a triggering spouse. You have a triggering child. I get it. You are being crunched in. You're being squeezed in by so much. Just take a deep breath and I want to ask yourself, not what to do about the spouse, not to do what about the kid, maybe even not what you want to do about the trauma. Because those are all things that are boxing you in right now. I want you to look for the open door. Right? I want you to look in the horizon. And can you envision for yourself what kind of person you want to be tomorrow? Do you want to be the person that doesn't get triggered by the triggering spouse? The trigger's in you. They try to squeeze the trigger. That trigger's inside of you. You can disable that trigger. You can say, the impossibly unhappy child, and people say you can only be as happy as your least happy child. And I say, yeah, it's an adage. Some of it is true, but actually it's not completely true. It's not completely true. Because our inner well-being certainly is connected to the well-being of our children, not ultimately. Because I've counseled families whose children are really in trouble. And the parent, this is the topic of our class on Wednesday night, and the parent feels so guilty and so shameful that the child's in trouble. In fact, I can speak about this because the person was so vulnerable in class on Wednesday night. The person wrote to me and I said, look, bring it up in class. I was speaking about it obliquely, and the person said, okay, that was I that wrote the email. I'll just go ahead and talk. And all of us in class number were profoundly impressed by her vulnerability and her willingness to open up, and for me to use that as a model engagement of being a compassionate listener, to draw out her inner feelings, and then provide what I will call the healing of shame and guilt, is to look at yourself rationally. We sometimes far overestimate how bad we are because of the dominance of feelings of shame and guilt. And as I looked at the person, I saw the person with just terrible sadness on her face, and her shoulders hunched over. And I had just a couple of questions. Is your daughter willing to work this through? And those of you there heard her say, yes. I said, now the question is, what kind of parent is she going to work this through with? One hunched over and depressed, with grief and sadness etched into her face, overburdened by depression and guilt and shame? Or a parent who sits up straight, looks and says, I've done wrong. I've been an unconscious parent, but I'm committed to my thriving and your thriving. And I will deal with this. I will do whatever it takes to repair the past, But I said to the person sitting in front of the whole class, I said, but you have to communicate resilience and sincerity and will and commitment and consciousness, not depression and shame and grief. Because if you do that, I know you feel it, but if you do it, you're unconsciously burdening your child with those feelings. Now, the child has to take care of the grieving parent. I'm not saying children shouldn't have to take care of the grieving parents, but in this case, you're adding to the damage of the child. And I say, you need to be a force of change in your life and your child's life and model that. And those of us who were in the class, I think you all noticed a little bit of change in the posture. Even as I was teaching, I felt my posture change. I mean, I was saying things I need to say to myself. So my archetypal teaching for today in the journey of Jacob, it's also the journey of Esau, is how we choose out of the deepest parts of our being. We choose for good, and then it seems that sometimes life can turn on us, or maybe we have turned on ourselves. And then we say to ourselves in this dark night of the soul, I'm not going to be that person burdened in that way. So this is my rumination. All this, by the way, is my Rashi on a couple lines in Jacob where it says, "Vayisei Yaakov Beersheva vayelech harana." Jacob left Beersheva vayelech harana vayifga b'makom. So in my thinking, all this is taken between those two verses. Vayifga b'makom, which means he arrived suddenly at the place. Vayalen sham, and he slept there. Kiva hashemesh. Okay, so between he left Beersheba, he arrives there. In that moment, in my imagination, Jacob is ruminating on all of this as he goes to sleep. He goes to sleep saying, the person I have been until now, and even these past days filled with resentment and victimhood and hating my brother and my father for his blindness and my mother for bringing me into this and God for making his birth out of order. All that, yeah, it happened. But who I am tomorrow is my choice. In my midrash on Jacob, he goes to sleep with those words. Now, what happens when he goes to sleep with those words in my midrash? Suddenly he dreams. Abu Sulam Mutzar Arza, a ladder rooted in the earth. You might say that's how things are now. The ladder is rooted there. Verosho Magia Hashamayma, but the top of the ladder is reaching into heavens. In this inner psychological interpretation, that's human potential. That's where you could go. And then it says the angels of God ascending and descending. By the way, Viva asked a great question. She says, aren't angels supposed to fly? What are they doing climbing ladders? That was a great question. And it really made me think. And I thought to myself, remember the word malach, angel, the shorish of the word is milacha, which means toil, work, energy, or as my teacher said it, labor or energy. So try to imagine the ladder is animated by divine energy, a current. So he dreamt of a ladder with a current, and in this current there's divine energy coming down, and there's his energy going up. And the ladder, from my perspective, was as it were, an image of what Jacob's decision was. He says, I'm not going to continuously live with, as it were, a bridge only to my past. I'm going to create a ladder into my future, not just to my future, but toward an actualized future. And that's when God speaks to him. What's interesting is for all that time he was dwelling in tents, as far as we know, God never spoke to him. That's the night God speaks to him. In the brokenness of the dark night of the soul, and in my midrash, in the willingness to say, I'm broken. It has not going my way. This was not my life plan. But my decision is, what will I become? What will I be tomorrow? That's the only thing in his hands. At that moment, the ladder can be rooted in the earth, its head up in the heavens, a divine current going through them, and then God speaking to him, promising to take care of him. this is a beautiful gift that God made. And I'm sure if one has ever has a sense that God says, I will provide for you, I will take care of you. That's a wonderful thing to have. I don't know if I would trust it, because if you look at the rest of Jacob's life, there was a lot of pain and tragedy coming. If he thought that meant he was going to live a life without pain and tragedy, that's not what that promise meant. But what comes next for me is what seals this as such a profound archetypal story, is that Jacob awakes. Vayikatz Yaakov Mishnato. Jacob awakes from his sleeping. Vayomer Achen. Verily, indeed, Yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh, v'anochi lo yadati. There is God in this place, but I didn't know. Now, what place is that? I mean, I don't think there's any place where you look at a campsite and say, well, there's no God in this place. It had to be in that God-forsaken gay that where I discovered, where the scapegoat was sent many years ago out past Lake Mead. I actually went to a God-forsaken place. It's not that place. He's somewhere in the hill country near Yerushalayim. So I don't think he arrived there and said, God is not in that place. So when he says, Yesh Adonai, Achen, Yesh Adonai mamakom hazeh, this place, is there divinity in my brokenness? Is there divinity in my looking at my life and saying, it's all come apart? And even though he says, all right, I'm not going to live here, how much he did not know, that's where God is. As Leonard wrote, there's a crack in everything, and that's where the light shines in. It's a deeply, purely Kabbalistic idea that's in the breaking of the husk that the spark can be released. When he says, Achen, Yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh, there's God in this place of brokenness, that's where the light comes in. V'anochi lo yadati, I didn't know. And this is something that I have to share with you. I see this so often when people start with virtue work, and they say, but shouldn't I say what I feel? And how do I correct others if I don't criticize them? I say, you just got to try it. And they think, okay, honor code, schmonor code, fine. I'll quit with the 4 C's. And they work on it. And so the light goes on. When I live behind the wall of virtue, I discover my own struggle. So it's not that I'm committed to an honor code. I'm discovering the resistance to the honor code that's been shadowing my whole life. It's not the behavior. In fact, sometimes the behavior is the thing that alerts you to that you have a shadow that hits up against the honor code. When one discovers the forces inside that excuse you from living up to an honor code, you've discovered the shadow. You've discovered the shadow. And when you discover the shadow and you start fighting the shadow, I mean, I've known people in a terrible life or death struggle to stop hurting other people with their words. Stop depressing. Stop with the defensiveness. Stop with manipulating other people. Stop all that stuff. Just live with honor. And they struggle and struggle. One day they say, I get it now. There's God here. Now, why couldn't they experience God before this? Because there is no room for God. With so much anger and depression and hostility, and being the object of, defenselessly being the object of others' manipulations, lack of good boundary, with all of that going on, there is no room for the experience of God. So people come to me and say, I want to experience God. I say, with all that going on, we got to clear all that up, because any experience of God is just going to be going around all of this, and I don't think that's God's will. I don't think God's will says, leave your life a mess, we'll cut a backroom deal. I don't think that's the way it works. You got to clean up this mess. And as it were, God comes in through the front door. But you got to clean this up. And that's why I say to people, 9/10 virtue, 1/10 depth. 9/10 virtue and wisdom, 1/10 depth. Clean this up. I think Jacob is on the road, as it were, to clean this up. Yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh. There's God in that place. I've seen this so many times in myself and other people. I didn't know that a life of honor leads to the knowledge of God. I didn't know it. So many people don't know that a life of honor leads to the knowledge of God. Then he says, Vayira, and he was filled with awe. Vayomer, and he says, Ma norah makom hazeh. How awesome is this place? Now, the text says he's speaking about this place he went to, but I can only interpret this from an archetypological perspective. When you have that moment where you realize The life of honor makes room for the experience of God. And by the way, when I mean honor, I don't only mean interpersonal honor. I mean the road of inner dignity, inner honor, where you no longer allow the unregulated, unconscious ego self. You no longer never allow the drives of the Yetzer Hara to depression and anxiety and guilt and shame, that you are leading your life. You can't extinguish those things, but you can take the battle to the disruptions in the ego self. You can take the battle to the Yetzer Hara and not surrender to its destructive forces. Right? This is spiritual warriorship. This is true spiritual warriorship. And in class last night, I was talking about, a person said to me, Rabbi Finley, these are such martial images, a woman speaking. I said, you got to find your inner Amazon. I hope you don't mind my saying it. I'm going to find my inner Spartan. Yeah, this is war. And if you've never had this war, God bless you. Because the rest of us have had this war. And you got to treat it like a war. And as I say, let's take the war to the enemy. Don't wait for the enemy to attack us in a weak moment, and then either our inner attacking forces or other attacking forces just spring out. You take the battle to the enemy every single day in your spiritual practice, where you find your Yetzer Hara hiding out, and you take the battle to the enemy, and you don't let the Yetzer Hara. I try to bring my forces out in the morning before I talk to anybody. I want to fight that fight now. I don't want you to suddenly come out in some moment where I'm not trained and guarded. I want to train in the morning for the rest of the day. So when he says, Ma no raha makom hazeh, how awesome is this place? I'm interpreting that to be the awesomeness of this work. It's truly awesome work. And people don't know that when they start with no 4Cs, no bad Jedi. Oh my God, it sounds pedantic and sounds so repressive. I don't want to. Part of me wants to say, you have no idea where this is leading. Because I don't want to say, I don't want people to say, well, let's talk about that, because I don't want to talk about that yet. Well, what do I do now? Stop with the angering. Stop with the criticizing. Stop with the defensiveness. Stop with the depression. Stop with the anxiety. Well, how do I do it? I'll show you how to do it, but you have the will to do it. You got to have the will to train. The will to train, not just talk about it, but to train. Well, what happens next? I said, we'll get there when we get there. And then that magic moment, when a person says, I get it. I get it. Ma no raha makom hazeh. How awesome is this place? Ein zeh kit beit Elohim. This is the house of God. It truly is the abode of God. V'zeh sha'ar hashamayim. And this is the gate to heaven. It truly is. It truly is the gate to heaven. And then it says, so Jacob wakes up. He takes the stone, creates a matzeva, some kind of physical thing, pours oil on it, and dedicates the place. Vayikra Shem HaMakom Hahu Beit El, and that has become a memorial place. This is called Beit El. Vulam Luz Shem Ha'ir Larishona. Why does the Torah have to tell us? But it was called Luz Barishona. What does Luz mean? Well, look at a good biblical dictionary. Luz means almond. Almond. But how do you say almond in Hebrew? Shaked. Shaked. And what does the Hebrew word lishkod mean? What does it mean, lishkod? It means to be diligent. It means to have the will to continue, to be tough. So, luz meant almond in Hebrew. I think it is in the intention of the author. When I finally looked up the word luz, I had shudders. It's called the house of God. It used to be called Resilience. That was the name of the place earlier. But Resilience has now become the house of God.